Well, again, this is one of these areas where science is giving us more and more information. And you have to put together a lot of information from various fields in order to answer the question. Why? Well, if you take temperature, just a simple thing that we're now worried about whether the Earth is warming. We only had measurements with thermometers that we can rely on of temperature from back into the 19th century. So how do we know what the trends were or earlier than that? Same thing with sea level. We've only had the most direct but crude measurement of sea level tide gauges back until about 1900. In fact, it's one of the oldest and most continuously operating tide gauge in America is in Baltimore. So we have this record of tide gauges that go back until about 1900. And if you look at that, the early part of that century until about 1920 was fairly level, and then sea levels started to gradually creep up and increase. Now we have more sophisticated new ways of measuring sea level, not only by a limited number of tide gauges around the world, that are only operated. Most of them had only been operated for less than 50 years or so. But we now have, since the 1980s, we have very sophisticated and very accurate satellite-based measurements. Now, it's going to be hard to believe, but this is the state of the technology. There's satellites flying overhead that are with a laser measurement, measuring the distance between the satellite and the level of the land or the ocean. And it goes by, continuously, and it's, lots and lots of measurements. So with those measurements, they measure the altitude, the difference between the satellite and the level of the ocean. We've now been able to measure sea level rise on a global basis all over the world's oceans, very precisely, not only over periods of decades, but interannually, seasonally, and the like. Very fascinating amount of information, what it tells us. And then we need some geology and some wonderful work that's just been done in the marshes of the East Coast to be able to let the little critters that live in the marsh tell us where the water level was, because they only live right at this interface. And if we can take a core down, we can actually reconstruct sea level rise. So if you put all of those together, that historical analysis based upon the geology and the paleontology, if you will, the little fossils in the marsh deposits, the sea level record through sea level rise record through tide gauges, and the satellite evidence. This is the story. For about 2,000 years, we've had fairly constant sea levels. Of course, we were sinking here, so that was one factor, and many other parts of the world are sinking or rising and so on. So if you take that out, the level of the oceans were fairly constant until the late 1800s. And then we began to have an increase around the turn of the century. And then in the late 20th century, that rate of increase essentially doubled. So whereas before we were having like 19th century, zero change in the ocean level, over the 20th century, about 1.8 or 9 millimeters per year. The latter 20th century up to the present, about 3.5 millimeters per year. So that evidence is pretty dramatic and strong. It's very consistent with the increase in global mean temperature from the temperature measurement I talked about. So the coupling between the two is very clear. Going forward, though, it's hard to predict how those two will fall in the lockstep, because the other big contributor that we're just beginning to see, as I mentioned, is the polar ice. And we don't know how rapidly that will melt. It's going to melt more slowly than the Earth warms, but exactly how much more slowly? There's a perverse side of that, though, and that is if we don't deal with the warming, we'll get to the point where the melting of this polar ice is unstoppable. You know, it's sort of reached a tipping point, and the choices we make during this century are going to determine whether we are setting the Earth to a course of a 10, 20-foot rise in sea level rise in the subsequent centuries. There's nothing they can do about it, or the folks in the next century can do about it. It's really our choice to make. So we have to be thinking not only of what it means to Anne Arundel County this day, you know, in the next 20, 50, 40 years, or even the century, but what are the consequences of this to future generations who come after us in the subsequent centuries?